Chapter 8, The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we take a step back into the founding era of the United States, exploring two of the most important documents in American political history, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. If federalism, which we studied in Chapter 7, gave us the structure for sharing power, these two documents gave us the ideas and the framework that still shape our democracy today. Let's begin with the Declaration of Independence. Written in 1776 primarily by Thomas Jefferson, this document was not just a notice of separation from Britain, it was a statement of principles. The colonists had lived under mercantilism and monarchy, systems where power was centralized in the king and wealth flowed back to England. They resented taxation without representation, restrictions on trade, and the heavy hand of imperial authority. The Declaration announced to the world that Americans were asserting their right to self-rule. Jefferson drew heavily from John Locke's social contract theory. Locke argued that governments exist to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Jefferson famously adapted this into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration laid out grievances against King George III and asserted that when a government becomes destructive of rights, the people have the right, even the duty, to alter or abolish it. While the Declaration provided the philosophical foundation, it did not create a government. That task fell to the Constitution, drafted in 1787 after the failure of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles had left the national government weak. No power to tax, no executive branch, no ability to enforce laws across states. The Constitutional Convention sought to correct this while avoiding tyranny. The result was a system of checks and balances, separation of powers, and federalism. Three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, were created to ensure no single branch could dominate. Power was also divided between the national government and the states. This was Madison's genius in the Federalist Papers. Ambition would counteract ambition, and power would check power. But the Constitution was controversial. Federalists supported it, arguing that a stronger central government was necessary. Anti-Federalists feared centralization and demanded protections for individual rights. Ratification was only possible with the promise of a Bill of Rights, adopted in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms like speech, press, religion, due process, and the right to bear arms. These amendments turned the Constitution into not just a framework of government, but a protector of liberty. We also need to remember that the Constitution is a living document. It has been amended, interpreted, and contested over time. Marbury versus Madison, 1803, established judicial review, allowing the Supreme Court to strike down unconstitutional laws. The Civil War amendments abolished slavery and guaranteed equal protection under the law. Later amendments expanded voting rights to women, young people, and racial minorities. Each change reflects America's ongoing struggle to live up to the ideals first set out in 1776. Of course, these documents also reveal contradictions. The Declaration spoke of equality, yet slavery persisted. The Constitution counted enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person for representation. Women and non-property owners were excluded from political participation. In this sense, the founding documents are both inspiring and flawed, embodying ideals that would take centuries of struggle to expand and realize. Today, debates about the Constitution continue with remarkable intensity. At the heart of the discussion lies the question of interpretation. Should the Constitution be read strictly according to the framers' original intent, a philosophy known as originalism, or should it be treated as a living document that evolves to address new and unforeseen challenges? Originalists argue that only by anchoring the meaning of the Constitution to its original context can we preserve the rule of law and prevent judges from imposing their own values. Living constitutionalists counter that the framers themselves could not have anticipated modern realities like nuclear weapons, digital surveillance, or same-sex marriage, and that the Constitution's broad principles were designed to be flexible enough to meet the demands of future generations. Alongside interpretation, questions arise about amendment. Should the Constitution be formally revised to address pressing modern issues such as campaign finance, voting rights protections, or digital privacy in an age of mass data collection? Some argue that the amendment process is too difficult, making constitutional change nearly impossible, while others insist that this difficulty protects the nation from hasty or short-sighted reforms. These ongoing debates reveal that the Constitution is far more than a historical artifact displayed in glass at the National Archives. It remains a living force in American political life, shaping court decisions, legislative battles, and national identity. Every dispute over rights, power, and governance, from healthcare reform to gun regulation, ultimately circles back to this foundational document, underscoring its central role in defining the American experiment in self-government. Here are some concrete examples of originalism in practice today. 1. District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008. The Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to own firearms. Justice Antonin Scalia's majority opinion leaned heavily on originalist reasoning, examining 18th century texts, state constitutions, and historical practices to argue that the framers intended the right of individuals, not just militias, to bear arms. 2. Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, 2022. This case overturned Roe v. Wade, 1973, ending the federal constitutional right to abortion. Justice Samuel Alito's majority opinion relied on an originalist approach, stating that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, and therefore not protected under the 14th Amendment. 3. Justice Clarence Thomas's jurisprudence. Thomas is perhaps the most consistent originalist on the current court. In short, originalism today is most visible in Supreme Court decisions on guns, abortion, religion, and federal power, with justices grounding their arguments in history, tradition, and the framers' intent rather than modern policy considerations. In areas ranging from the Establishment Clause, religion and government, to the Commerce Clause, limits on federal power, he regularly calls for revisiting or overturning precedents that, in his view, stray from the Constitution's original meaning. 4. Debates on the administrative state originalists argue that agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, exercise powers not intended by the framers. Recent cases, such as West Virginia v. EPA, 2022, have reflected originalist skepticism toward broad federal regulatory authority, stressing that Congress, not unelected agencies, must clearly authorize major actions. 5. Gun rights beyond Heller. In New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, 2022, the court struck down New York's restrictions on concealed carry. Justice Thomas wrote that gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, an explicitly originalist test. When we talk about constitutional interpretation, not everyone agrees that we should be bound by the exact intentions of the framers from the late 18th century. Another powerful perspective is the idea of the Constitution as a living document. This theory holds that the Constitution was written with broad principles, liberty, equality, due process, precisely because the framers knew that society would change in ways they could never predict. Instead of freezing the meaning of the text in time, the living document approach says those principles must be interpreted in light of contemporary values, knowledge, and circumstances. Another powerful example is Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, the case that recognized same-sex marriage as a constitutional right. The Constitution doesn't mention marriage, and certainly not same-sex marriage, but the court reasoned that the principles of liberty and equality extend to this fundamental area of life. Justice Kennedy's opinion emphasized human dignity, social change, and the way constitutional values must grow with society. We also see the living document theory in cases involving privacy. The framers never wrote the words, right to privacy, but in Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, and later Lawrence v. Texas, 2003, the court found that the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment, taken together, protect intimate decisions from government intrusion. These rulings reflect an understanding that personal freedom has expanded in meaning over time. Another area where this approach is clear is the 8th Amendment. The ban on cruel and unusual punishment isn't locked to 18th century punishments like stocks or whipping. Instead, the court has spoken of evolving standards of decency. That's why it has barred the death penalty for juveniles and for people with intellectual disabilities. The meaning of cruelty, the court says, shifts as society matures, and perhaps the most modern example comes with technology. In Carpenter v. United States, 2018, the court held that police need a warrant to access cell phone location data. The framers never dreamed of smartphones, but the principle of protecting citizens from unreasonable searches applies just as much to digital trails as it once did to locked desk drawers. Taken together, these examples show us that the Constitution is not a relic trapped in the past. It's a framework designed to adapt, ensuring that liberty, equality, and justice remain relevant in each generation. In this sense, the living document theory argues that honoring the Constitution sometimes means reimagining it for the challenges of today. One of the most famous examples is Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. The court struck down racial segregation in schools, declaring that separate but equal was inherently unequal. Now, if the justices had asked what the framers of the 14th Amendment thought in 1868, they would have found that many still tolerated segregated schools. But instead, the court considered the real-world effects of segregation and the evolving understanding of equality. This is living constitutionalism in action, taking the broad promise of equal protection and applying it in a way that matched modern understandings of justice. In conclusion, Chapter 8 teaches us that the Declaration of Independence gave Americans their identity, a people committed to liberty, equality, and self-government. The Constitution gave Americans their system, a framework for governing that has endured for over 2 centuries. Together, these documents are the heart of American political science, reminding us that ideals must be paired with institutions and that democracy is always a work in progress. Next time in Chapter 9, we'll explore civil liberties, the rights that protect individuals from government power.